Wendy's $3 breakfast deal is a bacon or sausage, egg croissant, plus small seasoned potatoes for $3. It's the breakfast that don't miss. So if you did miss Wendy's breakfast, don't imagine. Fresh cracked eggs, sizzling sausage, crispy bacon, and block out those hot, buttery, flaky croissants. Croissants don't really make a sound, but if they did... For a breakfast that don't miss, Wendy's is that breakfast. Choose wisely. Choose Wendy's $3 breakfast deal.
Limited time only at participating U.S. Wendy's. Select a request $3 breakfast deal to obtain discount. Not valid for a la carte or combo orders.
Hey, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of JavaScript Jabber. This week on our panel, we have Steve Edwards.
Hola from Portland.
AJ O'Neill.
Yo, yo, yo. Coming at you live from No Hairsville.
No Hairsville? What are you talking about? You got plenty of hair on your head.
Yeah.
Hanging out with you guys.
Unlike some of us.
Yeah. You're making fun of us. Okay, I get it.
Actually, it's that in case you can't tell, my hair's gone. I mean,
gone?
Yes, I still have about 1,000 times more than any of you combined, but I used to have nice lion-like locks of hair, and now summer hit, and whew.
So is that a lot of gray I'm seeing, or just bleached out?
Oh, that's gray.
Oh, okay.
That's gray. That's beautiful gray.
Yeah, I lost mine before it went gray. We also have Dan Shapir.
Hey, from nice, warm and sunny Tel Aviv.
Awesome. I'm Charles Max Wood from Top End Devs, and I just want to tell people to go check out JavaScript Remote Conference. It's going to be the end of October, and we're starting to fill in spots. The CFP's open, so anyway, looking forward to putting that together. This week, we're going to be talking about features of JavaScript not to use. I think AJ's list is probably longer than Dan's. But Dan, you gave us a list, and this was, I guess, inspired by a tweet that AJ put out. So I'll let you guys fight over who gets to start first. And yeah, let's dive in and talk about what's in JavaScript that we should avoid using anymore. Hey folks, this is Charles Max Wood from Top End Devs. And lately I've been working on actually building out Top End Devs. If you're interested, you can go to topenddevs.com/podcast, and you can actually hear a little bit more about my story, about why I'm doing what I'm doing with Top End Devs, why I changed it from devchat.tv to Top End Devs. But what I really want to get into is that I have decided that I'm going to build the platform that I always wished I had with devchat.tv. And I renamed it to Top End Devs because I want to give you the resources that are going to help you to build the career that you want, right? So whether you want to be an influencer in tech, whether you want to go and just max out your salary and then go live a lifestyle with your family, your friends, or just traveling the world or whatever, I want to give you the resources that are going to help you do that. We're going to have career and leadership resources in there, and we're going to be giving you content on a regular basis to help you level up and max out your career. So go check it out at topenddevs.com. If you sign up before my birthday, that's December 14th. If you sign up before my birthday, you can get 50% off the lifetime of your subscription. Once again, that's topenddevs.com.
AJ, it was your tweet. You want to start?
Oh, absolutely not. People have heard me rant about this tons of times. I think you should start, and then I'll be the devil's advocate as to why we should have this.
Okay, cool.
Mix it up. Keep it fresh.
Yeah. I do want to say to begin with, there's this saying that only Sith deal in absolutes. So it also pertains to this list. I mean, I'm going to list a whole bunch of things that I argue that you shouldn't use when coding in JavaScript or TypeScript, by the way. But I undoubtedly, listeners or we ourselves might say, oh, I used that feature once and it came out really handy. And, that could definitely be the case. The top of the list is probably eval. And I personally have used eval a few times where it did make sense. So every rule has, how would I say it? Has its exceptions. There are exceptions to every rule. So yeah, but still, it's a list of things that overall I think are better left unused in JavaScript.
I think that I'm going to first counter with taking my normal position, actually. There are many things in the language which, if you don't use them, there is no difference other than the letters that you type. And those are primarily the things that I think ought to be eliminated, because there is never a case where using them gives you any benefit other than something that is purely cosmetic.
We'll see. Okay, let's start going down the list and we will see, I guess.
Okay.
Although I'm looking at the size of this list, I'm going, okay, after we get through this list, what's left?
I know, right?
No,
Yeah,
seriously, like it reminds me. One time, my wife is sort of a picky eater, and she doesn't like a lot of the things that will be put on foods, and she likes stuff on the side. You know, if you've ever seen When Harry Met Sally, always on the side. And so one time we went to this Greek deli. It was a well-known Greek deli in Portland, and so the waiter's asking what she wants, and she wants a hero. You know, it's not gyro, it's hero. And she says, well, I don't want this and this and this. And she goes, what's left? She goes, the meat. There's nothing left. So I'm looking at this going, okay, this will be interesting.
What's left? The important part that you need to live.
The meat.
You know what's offensive about that when I go out with my wife, because she's the same way, is that I'll order hers with all the stuff not on it, and then I'll order mine with all the stuff on it, and they'll give us two of them without the stuff on either of them. And then I have to take it back and go, no, I want all the good stuff on mine. So Dan, what are you taking away from us? No candy, huh?
Yeah. Let's start, as I said, let's start with the obvious one. Let's start with eval, and which is often said that eval is evil and should be avoided. So what do you guys think? Should eval be avoided? Or maybe
I'm just glad you didn't say never, because anyway.
No, like I said, I've actually used it on occasion because, very rarely it does make sense. And it's one of those things that when you need it, there really are no alternatives. I mean,
right.
Yeah, you can execute code using a function constructor instead of eval, but I just
that's a synonym.
Yeah, essentially.
Yeah.
There's some semantic differences, but it's essentially the same. So when you do need eval, there really are no alternatives to eval. But
well, you could just ship a parser with your code like Angular does, and doesn't React do that as well?
Oh, God.
Well, not with the
just
code.
Ship a parser in the browser. Everybody's got maximum bandwidth these days. Why would you need to? Why not just have your own implementation of JavaScript? Then you can include TypeScript and all the other syntaxes, and you can exercise all your artistic liberties
and do it in WebAssembly, so it'll even run fast. But seriously, But then effectively you've just re-implemented eval, so you've not gotten away from it.
Yeah.
I would consider it to be effectively the same. So for those of you who somehow don't know, eval takes a string and then it parses and executes that string as JavaScript. And even more than that, eval executes that string in the current scope. So it has access to all the local variables, not just the globals and whatnot. And the big problem with eval is the fact that it's potentially really unsafe because you're using data as code. And, who knows where your data came from and, where it's been. And sanitizing is effectively impossible. So really the problem with eval is that it's risky, it's potentially dangerous, especially if used on the server. And that's about it. Any comments about that?
Well, I think we know that, especially early on, in order to get great performance, template libraries would do metaprogramming to the max, right? And that's the benefit of JavaScript, is you can do all this metaprogramming. You can generate code that you don't know what it does, and then just run it with more generated code.
Funny that you should mention that, because way, way, way back in the 90s, I wrote what I consider to be the first ever in the whole world progressive web app, which could even work offline inside the browser. And to get better performance in that, because it ran on IE4, I would actually generate custom JavaScript code for a particular operation and then hand it over to eval, just so that I could get the best possible performance out of it. But it turns out that these days, this is actually an anti-pattern, because when you execute JavaScript inside eval, you're not getting the benefits of the JavaScript optimizer. It's just interpreting the code. And beyond that, the fact that eval exists within a function precludes the JavaScript engine from optimizing that function that contains the eval. because, again, no point in getting into all sorts of technicalities. But at the end of the day, if that's your justification, then it's no longer valid.
But can't you generate really highly optimized functions that then you use eval to attach to an object? Then you don't have any of that pesky branching logic that slows you down by microticks.
If
the JIT can optimize that function.
Yeah, but that's the thing. First of all, let's put it this way. I've yet to see the case where that was in recent years. I'm not talking back in the 90s. In recent years, if you think that that's your performance issue, then you're probably wrong. But beyond that, as I explained, it's no longer the case because the JIT, in fact, does not optimize code inside eval. So performance
but once it's been evaled and now it exists in a namespace and you could call that function that you created. Why
could they optimize it? Perhaps. I doubt that they'd bother.
It'd be the same as just reading in the JavaScript on first run.
Yeah.
It's not optimized on the first run, but it should be optimized if it becomes a hotspot, because it would just be code like anything else.
Yeah, theoretically, but practically, let's put it this way. You should use eval when there is no choice except using eval, and not under any other circumstance, including thinking that maybe you're gaining a couple of microseconds, which you probably aren't. So that's the thing I have to say about eval. You shouldn't use it unless you have to use it.
Right. Well, yeah. And I think the primary concern over it isn't the performance. It's the security implications of it.
But real programmers write perfect code, so you don't need to worry about security. That's a bogus argument. If you know what you're doing, you're not going to write bad code.
Yeah. In a couple of weeks, by the way, we're going to have a guest that I invited to talk about Tomer Lichtash, to talk about a famous, should be famous story about called The Story of Mel, about this amazing programmer way back in the 50s. And I'm reminded of that because he actually said, and it's a quote in that story, what's the point of code that cannot rewrite itself? So I guess there are some crazy use cases out there these days. I think it's handled automatically in, machine learning and stuff like that. But there's no justification, I think, for a human developer these days to write self-modifying code by hand, again, unless they really have to. Anyway, let's move on to the next one, I think.
Yeah. Let's break somebody else's heart.
This one is what I consider to be the only JavaScript language feature that's been so effectively deprecated that it's essentially suppressed, to the extent that I think most JavaScript developers these days don't even know that it exists within the language. And but
I think they're going to be excited now, Dan, though. I think this is going to be a reason not
I get to use that.
Woo! No. Once you explain it, we're going to have so many listeners that are they're going to try it out. They're going to try it out for sure. And they might start using it in production because it's so great.
Anyway, that language and is called the with keyword or the with statement. And it's effectively deprecated because if you're in strict mode, you can't use it. And I will remind people that in ESM, in ES modules, they are strict mode by default, and that strict mode cannot be turned off. So in ES modules, you just can't use that with statement at all. Anyway, the idea with actually sounds really nice, as like AJ said. Once you hear it, you say, "Hey, I could use that." The thing is this: when we write JavaScript code with objects, we have a lot of code that is like, x.y.z or a.b.c. We use the dot operator a whole lot. And if we're writing object-oriented JavaScript, then we have this dot something again and again and again. And what with does is that with basically sets the scope in such a way that instead of writing x.y, you can do with x and then just y. Within that scope, you don't have to explicitly put the x dot in front of the y. It's implicitly there. So it kind of transforms an object into a scope, you might say. I hope.
Yeah, so basically it's just as good as let.
How do you mean?
It creates scope for things.
Well, let is defined, at quote unquote compile time, whereas JavaScript objects are wholly dynamic. So you can add properties onto them. And in fact, that's the big problem with. The fact that it's a dynamic scope. It's a scope that cannot be inferred at compile time. It can only be inferred at runtime based on the properties of whatever object you use for the width.
Well, we like dynamic. That's why we like JavaScript. We like having loose, weak types. We like being able to assign something to, as a number, and then as a string. We like being
I get
pull
that.
things into
I get
scope
that you're
willy-nilly.
being. I get that you're being sarcastic, but in reality, the fact that you can do something doesn't mean that you should do that thing. And the MDN, by the way, gives a pretty good explanation of why width should be avoided. So if you go to that section on width, there is a link right at the top about why it's a bad idea to use it and why it's been deprecated. And the reason, as I explained, is that it creates a dynamic scope. And the dynamic scope, it turns out that that's a bad idea. Again, if we look at the history of programming languages, it turns out that many programming languages, instead of using static scopes like most programming languages use these days, actually use dynamic scope. The original version of Lisp, for example, did that. The scope was kind of determined by the caller of the function rather than the scope in which a function was declared. And width kind of does that because the scope within the width is determined by that variable by that object that you use with the width. And it turns out that it's just a bad idea. It's one of those things that people thought might be a good idea, but then turned out to practically be bad ideas.
Well, you could just not have so many other things in scope, and you could use width and put it past in your object. And if you're not, I'm looking at this MDN example, but they're really contrived, right? You know what your variables are named. So unless it's something that you got from eval, then you should know what's on the object, and you'll know.
That's the thing about Java. That's the thing about JavaScript. We always know what's on our objects because nobody else can modify our objects. But really, the thing is this: the JavaScript optimizer, once it says a saw width, would have to totally bail because it can't. The fact that you have a variable declared, let's say using let or using var, it doesn't really matter. The JavaScript engine sees that at parse time. It's aware of all the variables that were declared within the scope. So it can do all sorts of optimizations. It can, it doesn't need to do a named lookup to get at a variable. Whereas once you've got width, then every scope becomes like a dictionary, and effectively you've got named lookups for everything. So yeah, it was a very bad idea in terms of performance. It led to bad coding practices, and it's effectively been removed from the language because, like I said, when you're in strict mode, it's just not there. So yeah.
Well, I get that Angular came out with strict mode, and maybe Vue has changed too, but for a long time in Angular 1 and Vue 1 and 2, width was used in the templating system so that you didn't have to have a root object that you had to access every time.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Another benefit of this is not only is it more ergonomic, but then you get shorter stack traces. So you're not wasting as much memory when there's an error, and you only get the one line of the evaluated code where stuff comes from, rather than getting the full stack trace that would lead you to where the bug is.
I would put it this way. First of all, JavaScript is not the only language that has this construct or had this construct. JavaScript actually borrowed it from other programming languages. I recall Visual Basic, I think, having the width construct. And when it's a class-based programming language where object structure is kind of well known, then it, is kind of more legitimate because the optimizer doesn't have a problem with it. It's JavaScript, it's the dynamic nature of JavaScript that made it problematic. But again, it was problematic from the implementation perspective and from some usages perspective. I'm totally not saying that there aren't scenarios in which saves you typing and makes the code potentially more readable. It definitely does. There is a reason why it exists in various programming languages. It's just that in JavaScript, it turns out it wasn't such a great idea. And again, it's essentially removed. So whether we wanted it or not, it's not there anymore. Anyway.
I want to try eval with.
Well,
that sounded weird.
You probably could.
That is how Vue 2 was done. That it caused a number of, but when I was using Vue 2, I think it was Vue 2, it might have been Vue 1, I'm pretty sure it was Vue 2. I would encounter these bugs, and they originated from my code, but because of the use of with coupled with the use of eval, it was literally impossible, because all you would see is something like foo is not defined, but you wouldn't know where foo wasn't defined, because when you use with, then you lose the context object. So you don't know, foo is undefined of person, because you see this all the time in these templating languages where they emulate this either in their own compiler or using something like with and eval, where when you go into a loop, you lose the context of the person, but you can access the properties of the person, the name and whatever. But then when you get the error, you just end up
and in
getting
this
name
case,
that's not defined, and you have no idea where it is.
Yeah, and in this case, it's even worse, because foo might either be a missing property on that object used in the with, or it might be a local variable that you somehow mistyped the name or something. So it potentially gets even worse, and you really can't tell the difference. Okay. Anyway, the next one that I've got on my list is the arguments object. For a long time, it was the way to go, because you really didn't have any choice. If you had a function that had a variable number of arguments, for example, the only way to get at the arguments was using the arguments object. These days, we've got the spread operator, and it's, from my perspective, so much cleaner, more readable, etc., that I don't really see any justification for using the arguments object anymore.
So this is describe what the arguments object is, Dan?
Well, it's an object that exists within a function scope. So when you invoke the function, it's this kind of thing that we actually spoke about in the past, in previous episode. It behaves as if it was an array, even though it isn't really. It actually is missing some array methods on its prototype. So that's another problem with it. You can get at the various variables through it, but it feels like it's close enough to an array that it's as if it's an array of the arguments that were passed to the function. So the first argument would be in arguments 0, the next one in arguments 1, and you've got arguments.length to get the actual number of arguments that were passed to that in that function call. And it's, like I said, it was totally needed, but these days there's just a better mechanism. Once we've got the spread operator on arrays, you can do the ... rest or whatever, or ... args or whatever you decide to call it, and access the arguments as an array that way. And in that case, it will be a real array and just that much better.
Well, I would argue that the spread operator is something that you never need to use for a couple of reasons.
That I would actually disagree with, but go on.
So
do go on, AJ.
If you need an array, just use an array. I really, really dislike, and I think it's very immature, because I think you'll agree with me on this one, Dan. If you have an optional array, then always pass the array. Don't sometimes pass one element, then there's only one, but then pass an array when there's 10. Just always pass an array.
You're saying that functions with a variable number of arguments are generally a bad idea. I would tend to agree with that.
And I think that I don't like the spread and collector syntax in JavaScript, because it doesn't follow what every other language does. And I assume it does that because if it did, it would create more syntax ambiguity and would lead to these problems where the tooling and whatnot can't figure out what you intended to do, because it's some weird situation where it's valid to have a triple dot.
Well, the spread operator in JavaScript is kind of overloaded, and we spoke about it in those episodes that we talked about the things that JavaScript developers should know, because we talked about the spread operator. So I would refer our listeners to those episodes. I don't want to go down that rabbit hole simply because we have such a long list of items still to discuss. But I would tend to agree with you that in most cases, using a variable number of arguments is not a great idea and that you should pass in an array instead. The only cases I think that where it does make sense is when you're kind of wrapping functions for some reason. So, for example, you've got things like Sentry or that can identify problems and report them. So, for example, you're making an AJAX call and it fails and it logs that to some system or whatever. And what they do is they wrap a lot of functions, and their generic wrapping function needs to be able to wrap functions with very different number of arguments. So they kind of have to be able to deal with variable number of arguments.
Then you're not dealing with an array as much as you're dealing with a tuple of unknown size.
Yeah, effectively.
But again, this is exactly what arguments is for. And I get the argument against arguments in that it's the whole pointer issue. The references.
We spoke about that as well. That was deprecated as well. If you're using strict mode, then that whole pointer thing doesn't exist. And again, I'll refer our listeners to that episode where we discussed that. Let's move on to the next one, if you don't mind.
Yes, it sounds like we're getting argumentative here.
Well, wait. I just calling the slice method, but do square brackets dot slice dot call arguments gives you back an array. You can use the arguments. I use arguments for exactly what you described. The reason that I wouldn't, the case, I don't like the whole syntax around the Splatty-doo where they've got the dots on the wrong side. But I use arguments. I don't have a problem with it, but I agree you have to use it with caution because you can't use it directly. I'll agree with that. Don't use arguments object directly.
Can we call this episode Splatty-doo and other JavaScript things you shouldn't use?
Yes,
for sure. The next one on my list, I wonder how many of our listeners actually even are aware that it exists in the language. It's do while, and I don't think you should use it for the very simple reason that I never really encounter scenarios where I need to use it. So if there's something in the language that doesn't really serve a purpose, then it shouldn't be in the language.
Well, isn't the reason that you need to do while is if you need the first iteration of the loop to run?
Right.
Regardless,
exactly.
You're checking an initial condition.
Yeah.
And if you don't use the do while, then you have to lift that initial condition up top and then repeat the condition inside the loop. So you have the condition and then you have your check and then you have the condition again, or you have to put the logic for checking the condition inside your loop, in which case you don't need the while either.
So, yeah, you're totally correct. And I would also add that JavaScript did not invent do while. Do while exists in C. So it got it from Java or C++ or whatever. Brendan Eich got his inspiration, for that from. But I'm just saying that I'm trying to think during the past decade, if I've ever really had the reason to use do while in my code, and I'm coming up short. I can't really think of any instance where I said, oh yeah, this is exactly the situation where I would need a do while for. And my experience is either that I need a test at the top of the loop, or in some cases I need a test in the middle of the loop. I'm hard pressed to think of a scenario where I need the test exactly at the bottom of the loop.
So this is where I would also argue you don't need while. While is superfluous.
Potentially. Well, you mean have a sort of a do loop construct and just break out of it or something like that, or just use for? Or?
Just for. Just use for. You don't, for any situation where you'd need, this is the reason I say this. People get so confused about loops, right? That because in their intro to programming 105 or whatever, they're told, oh yeah, you're going to need to know the difference between a while and a do while and a for and a loop and an until. And, we have all these different syntax sugars. It's all just a for loop. That's all it is. And if you understand how to use the for loop, then it's less mental overload. Just it's one tool that always works. And if you want a quote unquote while loop, it's just for semicolon condition semicolon, right?
Well, I would say this. The for loop in JavaScript is heavily inspired by the for loop in C. And the for loop in C is essentially a sort of a syntactic sugar around the while loop, where you've got the initialization, the test condition, and the increment that would in a while loop be placed all over the place. They're like bunched together to make it more readable. So you might say that while is the more primitive incarnation, as it were, of the looping construct. And again, JavaScript basically just inherited it from C. But I totally get where you're coming from. And I would even argue, I would also say that I generally tend to avoid these types of loops and prefer a more declarative type approach. By the way, it kind of reminds me that I did a poll on Twitter a while back where I asked people if they prefer while true or for with an empty test clause. And it turns out that a lot of people were wholly unaware that an empty test clause in a for loop is like a while true.
We need more people exposed to languages like Go. And I mean that so sincerely. I think one of the best ways you can learn a programming language is by learning another programming language. And Go is probably the most constrained language. And it's probably second to JavaScript in terms of popularity. I mean, you name a service you use that doesn't have all of its infrastructure written in Go, or that all is a strong word, but doesn't have its infrastructure predominantly written in Go.
But here's the thing. We don't really know what our infrastructure is implemented in. Like it's running on the back end.
Yeah. So folks, I'm here with JD from Raygun. JD, you guys get like 1 billion errors a month. What are some of the more interesting errors that you've seen over the years?
Oh, that's a good question. We certainly deal with a lot of errors. A couple of things come to mind. When we very first launched, and we kind of expected, we'd see some people sign up and try it. We actually got one of the top 10 Facebook games. Remember when they were huge? Mm-hmm. And so one of the top 10 Facebook games, and it was, between us, one of the most buggy bits of software I've ever seen. And so it managed to completely blow us off the internet in like our first week of launching. So we solved
That's why I couldn't win at poker.
Those Farmville animals. No.
Yeah.
And there was another one always sticks in my mind because obviously we track JavaScript, and just like with mobile error crash reporting, you can't access the end user's browser console to see errors. So you really want to track that and report it.
Right.
And I remember this one customer, and they had this really fancy animation on the cursor on their website. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, their JavaScript to do that, they deployed a bug with it, which meant that on every single mouse move event of every single customer they had would send an error report to Raygun. So, working at Raygun is like dealing with a constant distributed denial of service attack and doing it with style.
So if you want to know what kinds of interesting things are going on that you're not seeing in your app, you have to check out Raygun. They're doing a free trial right now. You can get it at raygun.com.
One thing that I just want to step in here with, because the do while, I know I've used it, and I know I've used it because it was the most natural fit for what I was trying to do, but I can't think of when. It's been a while. The other thing, though, is that,
Unintended?
argue... Pun not intended, but realized as soon as it came out of my mouth. But the other piece is if you're going to argue against having a while loop at all, typically I'm looking at for loops for something that has a structure and a clear way of iterating and a clear stopping place. And I guess while loops have that as well, but I'm not always operating on something that's just a clean set of iterations like that. A lot of times it feels more natural to me to just say, hey, just keep doing this until this condition is met, as opposed to here's how I'm going to set up my iterator, which is what you do in a for loop. And so,
but taking AJ's position, at the end of the day, the unless you're intentionally writing an infinite loop, something can change the clause.
That's true.
And that would be the operation that is the thing that progresses you through the iterations. But you know what? Building on everything that we talked about, I would actually move one of the items of my list from, way down to here. And that would be that I would tend to avoid for I type loops. Those are loops that use numeric indices.
Mm-hmm.
For I equals 0, I less than something, I plus plus, or whatever. I find myself not really using these anymore, at least in JavaScript. Yeah. How about you guys?
So how do you handle the async await in a loop then? Because they gave us all these cute little.
No, I'm not saying not to use.
That's a nightmare.
I'm not saying not to use for. You've got for of, which is great for that use case. I'm saying don't use the numeric indices. Instead, just use a for of to iterate over an array or a sequence or whatever. It might be a for of or for await of or whatever is appropriate. But you're correct.
Yeah, I agree. I almost never use the for I blah blah blah, and that's not to say you have to either, right? Because you can initialize I to anything, right? And you can iterate. You don't have to do a plus plus. You can iterate that anyway too, and have any kind of condition for your to end. But the for of is more natural and it reads easier for me.
Yeah, it's just that the for I, it's a throwback to the C days. It's when the array is effectively just a memory block, and you're iterating through that memory block. In a modern programming language, you want to work at a higher level of abstraction, so it's a sequence or whatever. And then a for of or something like that is the more appropriate construct to use.
In that vein, plus plus, great languages don't have it. For example,
somebody's been reading Crockford.
Yeah, but the plus plus is for semantically, it doesn't make sense. It's an abuse. It's an abuse of the language, right? Because it's not to increment something by one. It's to increment an array in hardware memory by the size of an element in the array. That's why it's plus plus rather than plus a number, is that the compiler is calculating what the size of the thing is and incrementing that size for you, so you don't have to do a size of and then a plus equals that size.
But again, that's C thing. In JavaScript,
it has no place in JavaScript.
In JavaScript, it's just equivalent to plus equals 1.
Mm-hmm.
Right, but it doesn't make any sense. It's counterintuitive, because if you knew what plus plus did, you would say, well, that doesn't make any sense in JavaScript because you're not incrementing by the size of a struct in JavaScript. You're incrementing by number.
Let me put it this way. Almost the only use that I had for the plus plus operator had been in for I loops. And once I more or less gave up on for I loops, I more or less gave up on the plus plus as well.
Oh, you know what I really hate? When people
things?
Occasionally you need to recursively call something. So say you're going to do the Fibonacci sequence or whatever. Maybe that's not one of the ones where you do this, but occasionally you recursively call something, and then people will pass in either plus plus I or I plus plus, and then it's a shortcut to I plus plus is a shortcut to increment on the next line. So it actually passes in the current value, but then increments it for the next iteration of the loop. I think that's the most confusing thing ever. And then plus plus I is equally confusing, but at least does the thing that intuitively would make sense, is that you would increment the thing that you're passing in. But I've seen bad loops where somebody's passing in a plus plus and actually nothing's changing because they have the plus plus on the wrong side.
You know what?
I like using plus plus I just to mess with people, but
I totally take your position on this, AJ. In modern JavaScript programming, I don't think the plus plus operator, whether prefix or postfix, really has a place. Especially, like I said, since I've essentially given up on the for I really don't see a use for it anymore.
Yeah.
Well, I'll give you one real use for a plus 2 or a plus 3 when you have data that's interleaved. For example, audio data or video data, where one segment of the track is going to be the right channel, another segment's going to be the left channel, another segment's going to be the subwoofer. And so you're taking interleaved data and you're iterating through each channel of the interleaved data. That's one case where, I mean, it's not super common because most people aren't dealing with interleaved data. But when you are dealing with interleaved data, it is the right tool for the job.
As I said at the very beginning, there are no absolutes. You're likely going to be able to find use cases where any one of these things that you shouldn't use actually makes perfect sense.
I'm going to put in a proposal to add plus plus 3 and plus plus 2 just so AJ has a shortcut.
But that because the plus equals 2 is
Yeah, plus plus 2 would be plus equals 2 anyway.
Yeah.
Or plus plus plus. Hey, we'll add them both. plus, 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 plus.
Yeah, that would be cool.
Yeah, instead of putting a number, just put the number of pluses that you want to add.
That's right.
So instead of being 0 indexed, it's 2 indexed. 2 pluses is 1, 3 pluses is 2.
Uh-huh.
It will increase readability for sure.
Yeah, that
definitely
wouldn't be confusing at all.
I want to add 50 pluses. The frame rate's 24, so you add 25 pluses.
That's nice. Another, going back to my list, another one that I would like to eliminate out of JavaScript coding, and again, I've hardly encountered it in recent years, and I don't really use it in my code at all, is the continue keyword. To the extent that I think that a lot of JavaScript developers, especially the newer ones, let's say, may not even be aware that it exists. Do you all remember what continue does?
I haven't used it in so long. I'm not sure I remember what it does.
I think was it when you're inside a loop and you tell it, okay, just keep going, even if some condition.
Yeah, it jumps directly to the next iteration of the loop. So it skips.
As compared
I
to
use
break, which breaks
continue
out
all
of
the
the loop.
time, like an early return.
I don't.
But I guess the argument could be made that should be a function because the loop's gotten too long.
Probably.
That's the one thing I'd say is if you're using continue, there's a high likelihood that your function is too long. But also, I don't know. I find it to be very useful as an early return. You're just saying, hey, if you meet this condition, skip this one, go on to the next one.
To the next
'Cause I wouldn't want
iteration.
to wrap that whole thing in an if.
Like you said, when I get to the point that where continue makes sense, I probably rip up the entire content of that loop into a function and just have an early return out of it.
Mm-hmm.
The bottom line is this, I guess it's a stylistic decision, but I've just not used continue in such a long time. I don't see continue in code written by other people. And I think there's a pretty good chance that if you do use it, people just won't even know what it does. I mean,
so in other words, we shouldn't continue to use it.
Interestingly, though, everybody still uses break.
I was going to say, Steve, give me a break.
This is going to be a really pun-filled episode, so it seems. Anyway, so these I think were the easy ones. Let's move to some items that are more contentious, perhaps. Although so far we've managed to argue about some of them, in even some cases that I didn't expect. So, does anybody really like classes in the language and thinks they should be used all over the place?
So my first Vue app that I did when I was working full-time was one that I had taken over for somebody else who had already started to build it. And he used classes extensively, and this was in Vue. And we used them primarily inside Vuex. And I got used to it after a while where he used classes and inheritance, and it made sense in just terms of the way it was built because you had certain things that were base stuff that you didn't want to have to repeat in other classes. At the same time, there were other ways to do it within JavaScript in terms of imports and so on. So I didn't think it was particularly problematic. It took some getting used to, but it made sense once you were inside of it and got used to using it. I don't know if something's readable and it works and there's not, for instance, major performance hits or something like that, I don't see a problem with using it. I'm curious to hear your reasons for it. There are people that are, like any topic in JavaScript, there are people that are very adamant about classes. No, they should never be used. And yes, they can be used. So there's always going to be somebody on either side of the opinion. But
so here's
it worked.
Here's my position. Here's my position. There are a few cases in JavaScript or in the browser where classes do make sense. For example, the API for web components was created in such a way that classes are the easiest and most natural way to implement web components. So if you're implementing web components, you probably need classes for that. But as a general programming construct, I really don't like them. They encourage implementation inheritance, and that's generally a bad idea.
Yeah. So it's interesting to discuss also from the standpoint of how they've kind of been used in the past. And the other thing I would bring into this argument is TypeScript, because TypeScript does encourage class usage more than regular JavaScript.
I kind of disagree with that. And I know that it came up in that discussion that you had on TypeScript, where unfortunately I wasn't able to join. Originally, that was the case. So when TypeScript came out, they were heavily inspired by Java, by C#, classes, interfaces, the whole shebang. And to me, and I know to a lot of other people, it made TypeScript look and feel like a poor man's Java. And I really didn't want anything to do with it. I think that over the years, they've realized that that was a bad idea. And what I currently see is that most people who are using TypeScript are using TypeScript without using classes. They're just using TypeScript for function signatures and APIs and whatnot. They're not declaring a whole bunch of interfaces and classes and stuff like that. Now, again, I might be mistaken. Maybe that's the code I'm seeing and other people are using TypeScript that way. But that is what I'm saying. And especially since React made that hard right turn and gave up on class components and chose hooks instead, and effectively inspired all the other frameworks to go in that direction as well. It seems
not all of them.
It's never all of them. But it seems that classes in JavaScript are on a steep decline. At least that's the way it seems to me.
It would be nice if React would update their documentation.
I think that they have. The React, if there's one good thing I have to say about React, is the fact that they do have excellent documentation.
I can say the last time I looked at the React documentation, and granted, it's been a while, was a little after that transition, and they showed you how to do it both ways. But React has definitely made a hard right turn and said, no, we're going to opt for hooks. We're going to do it this way. I know that a lot of the Vue community has been adopting TypeScript. Angular has had TypeScript in it for a long time, and they still, like, if you go look at their documentation, it'll still tell you to build classes. So, and there's not really a way that they tell you to do it different. So it's that's kind of where some of the context that I'm coming from is that I see people using this, and I see people building their entire app, including their components and everything else in Angular using TypeScript classes.
Well, if you're using Angular, then apparently you have no choice. So, you may like it or not, but it's a fact of life,
Yep. And I'm sure that they have reasons for it. I guess it doesn't feel that unnatural to me to use it that way, but they give you a lot of other things that make it easier to build your apps, right? As far as just straight up classes, if I'm building something that's just straight up JavaScript or TypeScript, I'm typically not using classes. But if I'm working in an Angular app, then I'm using classes, and it doesn't feel weird.
So the argument I have against classes is simply that classes are designed for languages that are procedural and synchronous. And that doesn't make sense in JavaScript because the state of the object changes asynchronously. And so you have to add a whole bunch of extra hoopla around class-based objects because the JavaScript is really about JSON. You serialize and you deserialize. You hydrate and you dehydrate, right? You just need to shift data from this point over here to this point over here. And all of that fluff in the middle, if it gets in the way of that, I think it's bad. And that's classes. Classes require that you instantiate something, that it's gonna split. You can't just take, you can't just call toJSON on any old class and then call the whatever it is .from and have this nice symmetric goes either way.
Well, you can, since it's JavaScript and you can do anything in JavaScript. But I totally get where you're coming from. Classes encourage a more structured and static type of objects.
No, it's not about being structured and static, because being structured and static is great.
No, I'm talking I'm talking that the structure of the class is more is like, I'm searching for the appropriate phrase. Is
uniform.
It's more uniform, less likely to change, less dynamic. It's also the relations between objects are more specified, hard-coded, as it were. But again, for me, the key thing is that implementation inheritance just turned out to be a pretty bad idea from my perspective.
Yeah, there are definitely trade-offs with inheritance, right? I mean, even in some of the languages like Ruby that's, very, very object-oriented class stuff, there are a lot of times where you wind up pulling things together and kind of constructing things as opposed to inheriting things in order to get the behavior you want. And the reason is because sometimes when you inherit the ability to interact with another class, it turns into this giant headache, where instead, if you can just insert a module, you dynamically add an interface or dynamically add functionality as you go, then it does that a lot more cleanly. And so there are, like I said, there are definite trade-offs to the approach. And if you don't need that heavy level of structure, then classes kind of feel like a weight around your neck as you're trying to move. So,
first of all, you say trade-offs. What are the upsides of inheritance? I'm not aware of any of those. And second, you can have really good structure.
Yes.
You can have types. You don't need classes for types. JavaScript has always had types. JSDoc has supported types for a long time, and TSC makes that work the way that you want.
I don't think we're going to argue on it. I think at the end of the day, we're mostly in agreement on this. So let's move to the next one. Prototypes. I don't think we should discuss it a whole lot. The appropriate reason to use prototypes is for polyfills. Unfortunately, people also sometimes use it for quote unquote performance reasons. And unless you're creating a trillion instances of a particular object, quote unquote type, there's absolutely no reason for it, and you shouldn't deal with that.
Wait, but how would you build a testing framework if you couldn't extend every object to have a .should, .be, .above? How could you possibly? You're throwing away every testing framework that exists.
I don't think so. But again, like I said, there are reasons. Some of them some of them really contrived, some of them less so. Some of them, like I said, are even reasonable. I mean, like I said, if you need to implement polyfills, then you absolutely, positively need prototypes. But generally speaking, just create object literals and put it in factory functions and go along your merry way, and just works great, and you don't need prototypes.
Well, that's the argument against classes as well, too.
Right.
Because there's kind of syntax. But seriously, how would you write a testing framework if you couldn't take every single primitive of the language and add .should, .be,
Well, usually what I see is that they actually usually wrap the original object. So you don't invoke should or whatever directly on the original object. You wrap it in something like expect something and then do a dot should. So you create a wrapper around that object instead of modifying that original object.
Yeah, or you do some kind of functional comparison that effectively does the same thing without the wrapper, where it's expect equal XY kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
And so then you don't necessarily have the wrapper like Dan's talking about, but it does the comparison or the check or the lookup or whatever.
I think that adding properties on the original objects is way, way dangerous and problematic. It's likely to
you're asking for problems.
Yeah, conflicts and stuff like that. No, I happen to create a totally reasonable method on my object that's called should or whatever, and all of a sudden I'm conflicting with the testing library.
Yep.
Anyway, moving on to the next one. Oh, that's a bit of a contentious one. I think we also talked about this in the past, so let's make it short, and that's this. I'm claiming that you shouldn't use this, but I know, AJ, I know that you love this. So what's your rationale for using this everywhere?
Well, it's pretty simple, right? If you want to know all the lines on which something is an instance of something else, if you just grep for this, you'll get most of your program. But if you were to give things names that are descriptive of what it is you're talking about, say person, or maybe just P for short, if you were to try to search through your code for that, then you'd only get the limited scope of things that are actually related and not be able to see it with the full context of every line of your code.
I love it when you're cynical. Yeah, for sure. I totally agree.
And then whenever you show someone a snippet of code, they can always tell, oh, this is an instance of something. Even if that 3-line snippet doesn't show the full context, they'll know it's an instance of something. If you just show them person.name, they won't know what that's an instance of.
Yeah. I will say one thing, though. Sometimes when I see code that makes extensive use of this, I feel like the itch to fix that code, and I really need to restrain myself, because If there's one thing that you should not do, is you should not try to refactor large portions of an application for no good reason. And you should generally abide by the existing coding practices within the code base. So I do support the Boy Scout rule, that you should leave code better than you found it. But you should, but you should not go around trying to refactor huge portions of the application just to make it look more pleasant to you because you prefer some other coding practices. So if there's a lot of this everywhere, it is what it is. But generally speaking, if you're writing new code, I would highly recommend avoiding this. Moving on to the next one. Basically, what I'm going to say is either use var or use let. Don't use both. It's a question of taste. I know AJ prefers var. I prefer const and then let. Use one or the other. Mixing them together is just a source of confusion. People start thinking about why is he using this here and why is he using that there. And they probably are reading way too much into it. And it's just a source of confusion. So pick your poison and stick with it. And it seems that most people are picking const and let over var.
That's what I'm seeing too.
The next one, the delete operator. Don't use that because it doesn't do what you think that it does if you actually have any idea that it exists. I know that a lot of JavaScript developers aren't even aware of it, but those that are aware of it, because they're familiar with the delete operator from other programming languages, usually it does something that's totally different than what delete does in those other programming languages. Are you familiar with a delete operator?
The only reason I use the delete operator is when I need something to not appear in the... So if you do object.keys on something, if you've set it to undefined, it'll still show up. Now, if you're passing this through a rational stringifier, it won't show up. For example, when you JSON.stringify things, nothing that's undefined will be copied over. Things that are null will be copied over, but not things that are undefined. But if you're using something that was created, I don't know, long after JSON.stringify that had every reason to behave as you would expect, such as URL query params, that will stringify things that are undefined. And so if you need something where, say you've got an object and it's got 4 possible parameters,
basically,
but you don't always.
Basically, what you're saying that is when you're using an object as a dictionary, it makes sense in some cases to use delete in order to remove something from the dictionary. In which case, I would say that in most cases where I'm using an object as a dictionary, I should probably be using a map instead if I'm using modern JavaScript. If only in order to show intent.
But then you have to deal with all the special methods and stuff. You can't use the normal. Then I have to learn a completely different set of functions for...
You have to learn things.
Now I have to work.
Well, no, I mean this sincerely, though. I mean, I don't want a lot of mental overhead. I do get the argument for we want to separate maps from structs because maps and structs fulfill different functions, just like we want to separate arrays from tuples because they fulfill different functions. But in JavaScript, we have one syntax. We have the array syntax for arrays and tuples, and we have the object syntax for maps and structs.
I would say, just as an aside, that there's a proposal for adding real tuples into JavaScript. There's
with parentheses.
I think they put. I think they're going to try to put the proposal is to put like a hashbang in front of the open bracket.
They're going to create a tuple class. I'm just kidding.
Anyway, but that's
that would be oxymoronic, and that's actually a really funny joke.
I thought it was, but nobody laughed. So anyway,
no, but you have to get the tuples and classes. It's just don't because you unrelated things in a structured format.
Yeah, but anyway, what delete does, just to clarify to our listeners in case they don't know, delete removes a property from an object if it's on that object. That's all it does. And it's generally a bad idea because you generally don't want to use objects in such a dynamic way because, like I said, if you want to use an object as a dictionary, you probably should be using a map. And the other thing is that it gets in the way of the JavaScript optimizer because when you're playing fast and loose with object structure, then It has to do actual name lookups rather than just using offsets within something called a hidden class. So just generate less efficient code for property access on that object, whatever. Anyway, that was the delete. Yeah, go on.
So, Steve, I just have to ask, if you use the delete operator to remove behavior from an object, does that make it dysfunctional? Sorry.
I think we are starting to run out of time, and I have a whole bunch of items left in the list. Actually, some of
part 2.
Some of the more contentious ones, I'll give like a preview. The else keyword, I think you shouldn't be using else, and there are a few more. So I guess we'll need to schedule.
That's heresy.
I guess we'll need to schedule a part 2.
That's clean code.
Yeah, we'll have to. But this was really good. And it, I mean, the thing that I like about these is that in some cases, I feel like we made the case, well, if you're doing this, then you may want to consider using these, anyway. And then the other thing is even if you completely disagree with us or disagree with Dan or disagree with AJ, there's enough of an argument there to where you should at least be thinking about why you disagree, right?
Yeah, for sure. To each their own. It's just based on our own personal experiences and, totally subjective. But you do need to take into account not just your own personal opinions, but also the opinions of people who are likely to be looking or reading your code. Most people don't work in a vacuum. And if you use a certain language feature that's fairly uncommon or effectively even deprecated, you need to take into account that there's a good chance that the other people on your team just won't understand what you're trying to do.
Right. All right. Well, we'll schedule Splatty-doo part 2 and let's do some picks.
Hi, this is Charles Max Wood from Top End Devs, and lately I've been coaching some people on starting some podcasts and in some cases just taking their career to the next level. Whether you're beginner going to intermediate going to advanced, whether you're trying to get noticed in the community or go freelance, I've been helping these folks figure out how to get in front of people, how to build relationships, and how to build their careers and max out and just go to the next level. So if you're interested in talking to me and having me help you go to the next level, go to topenddevs.com/coaching. I will give you a 1-hour free session where we can figure out what you're trying to do, where you're trying to go, and figure out what the next steps are. And then from there, we can figure out how to get you to the place you want to go. So once again, that's topenddevs.com/coaching.
Does that mean that if we have like 3 or 4 of them, then we can use spread operator to?
Yeah.
Anyway. All right, Dan, what are your picks?
Oh, I'm going first this time. Okay. Let me see. Okay. So my first pick is, I guess everybody who's listening to this podcast is probably familiar with the Can I Use website. I mean, how could you develop for the web and not know about Can I Use? So if somehow you've been living under a rock, this is this amazing service where you can go in and then type in the name of a JavaScript function or a CSS attribute or a DOM API or whatever, and then see what the support is like for that feature and capability so that you know whether you should or shouldn't be using it or should be careful about using it. And for the longest time, the table that is shown when you look up a feature like that had IE as the first browser. And now it's the last browser because IE is deprecated. So we don't really need to support IE anymore, at least the lucky ones among us. And consequently, it's no longer on the left. It's now the last one on the right in the desktop section. Mm-hmm. So that would be my first pick. The fact that IE is like going away and Can I Use is an example of that. My second pick is the one that I usually give as the last pick in my picks. And this time I'll give it as the one before last, and you'll see why in a second. And that's the ongoing war in Ukraine, which is just terrible and an example of how bad and evil people can be and how destructive. And it just keeps on going on. And I'm afraid that we're kind of getting desensitized to it, even though terrible atrocities are happening there on a regular basis. And it just doesn't seem to be heading towards an end. If anything, it seems to be just getting worse. So I don't know. It just makes me really, really sad. And the reason that I didn't have it as my last pick is because my last pick is actually an example of the good in people and the ingenuity in people, and that's the James Webb Telescope, Space Telescope. I guess that I'm one of those people who have been amazed by the pictures that are coming. It just shows what humanity is able to achieve when it sets its mind to it, and it's an astounding technological feat. By the way, I don't know if you know this, but there's actually a bit of JavaScript in the James Webb Telescope. Apparently, they're using some sort of outdated JavaScript parser that supports ES3 or something like that, and it's within the James Webb Telescope, so we now have JavaScript in space.
Oh my!
Yeah, and somehow it works.
JavaScript in space.
It's running IE, but
Yeah. No, I don't. Yeah, whatever. Anyway, so that would be my third and final pick, and those are my picks for today.
yeah, the James Webb Telescope is really cool. I'm super excited about that. So thanks for pointing that out. That wasn't even on my radar to pick. Steve, what are your picks?
Found a really funny post on the Babylon Bee. I'm a big fan of the Babylon Bee satire.
They're
site.
so funny.
Oh gosh, they're so good. But here's one that I think is very relevant and something I've heard among other people: standing desks. And the title is "Coworker Standing at Desk Obviously Just Hasn't Learned About Chairs Yet." So, witnesses claim to have walked past coworker Clarence Quell-Bryant's office multiple times to confirm that, yes, he had been in an uncomfortable standing position at his desk for hours, apparently oblivious to the fact that the company offers chairs to all employees. And goes on for there.
There's this episode on Family Guy where he works for his father-in-law, who forces him to stand at his desk and call everybody else the chair people, just so that everybody will hate him. And
Yeah, it's funny. At Publishing Time, it was revealed that Quell-Bryant was bringing oxygenated Mongolian glacier water to work because he was obviously unaware of the free Dr. Pepper in the break room. But anyway, I will post that in the show notes. It's pretty good. Dad jokes, the high point of the podcast, at least for some listeners. Oh, side note, Dan, did I understand you correctly on Twitter that you were talking to people at a conference about the podcast and somebody actually mentioned the dad jokes?
yeah, yes, they did. You do have fans out there.
Yeah, probably not many, but I have a few, and they're diehard ardent fans too. So I appreciate them very much.
I won't call them weirdos in public.
I still remember the post from the guy who was complimenting the podcast and said, "Yeah, I like all the smart people and that funny guy." Thank you.
Well, he did call you funny. Again, assuming he was talking about you, it's
right.
It's yet to be determined.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think of it as a backhanded compliment, if anything. But anyway, so I had a conversation with my wife the other day. I said, "Honey, I just saw a wolf." She said, "Where?" I said, "No, the regular kind."
Okay.
Sorry, dang it, wasn't ready with the delayed rim shot. Sorry, two mouses here. Let's see,
2 mouses or 2 mice?
Different computers.
No, I get that, but shouldn't you say 2 mice?
Oh, mouses, Mises. I think Mises from the cartoon character. The 2 Mises. Anyway, I went to my doctor recently, and he told me I have some really bad news. I'm afraid your DNA is backwards. And I said, and? Dan has a straight look. I'm hoping he got that one. Why doesn't Batman have supervision? Like supervision, like Superman? Because his parents died.
What?
Somebody told me too soon on that one. I'm thinking Batman's been around for how many decades?
It's not too soon. It's
And finally-
not that funny.
Supervision.
Yes.
Doesn't have supervision.
Mm-hmm.
Got it.
Died,
Got
yes.
it. Okay.
And finally, this is today's joke. What is more disgusting than finding a worm in your apple? Finding half of a worm in your
Well,
apple.
that's as old as time, I think.
Does it? First time I've heard it, believe it or not. But anyway, those are my picks.
All right, AJ, what are your picks?
Well, first of all, I'm going to pick this Canucha virginica. There's a weird moth that showed up in my room that it's quite pretty and distinct and apparently easy to describe. So I just did a brave image search for black moth with orange head, and it is unquestionably this Canucha virginica moth, and it just looks It just looks cool. It's friendly. I didn't realize this because I don't. Most moths that when I think of moths, they're ugly. They're kind of this gray drab. It's just kind of like, get out of here. You're sucking the color out of the room. But this one, it looked a little prettier because it had this splash of orange and it's got little antennae that I didn't realize that moths have
for our
antennae that look like
listeners,
feathers.
just so you know, AJ is now putting his fingers on the top of his head to simulate antenna.
Yeah, he's pantomiming the antennae.
Just like that the character in that Endgame movie, like that. That's what I'm doing.
Oh, Mantis.
Yeah, I think maybe, I don't know actually, but it moves them in opposite directions. Anyway, it's just kind of neat. It's been flying around and landing on stuff. Oh, it's back on the screen again. Now it's back on my screen again. It looks kind of like a firefly, but a big firefly. But it's a moth. Anyway, so yeah, kind of cool. Nature. Gonna pick nature, making its way inside because I've been working on the 4-wheeler and I was working on it last night and I was leaving the door open because if I'm using any of the chemicals, the fumes are really bad and I don't want them to get in the house. And there weren't mosquitoes out last night, thank goodness. But as a result, now today I have a lot of extra wildlife in the form of insects in the office garage here with me. And then after that, I'm going to pick Mistborn yet again because I started re-listening to the second book, or I guess listening to it for the first time because the first time I read it, I think. But yeah, going through the Well of Ascension, and gosh, they're just great books. Excuse me, great books. Also, I'm going to pick Pitch Gauge.
Yeah, those are really exciting books.
Yeah, you get it. You get me. I'm also going to pick. There's this thing called a pitch gauge. Turns out that measuring bolts and screws is not so hard. Well, particularly bolts. Bolts are quite standard. It seems screws have a lot more variety to them. But anyway, it's this thing called a pitch gauge, and it's like a set of 50 little teethy combs, and you put it on a bolt, and then when you find the right one, it tells you what the pitch of the threads on the bolt are, so that if you need to go replace, say, an old rusted broken bolt, you can get one that matches and be confident that it's the right one, even when you put it into the rusty bolt socket, bolt head. I don't know what you call it. What's the receiving end of the bolt? And it doesn't go in because it's old and rusty. No, not the nut, but because if you're looking at an engine, the bolt goes into the block of the engine. Yeah, I read you.
Yep.
Yeah. So anyway, having a pitch gauge and then a little $2 thing with the hole sizes from Lowe's makes me feel a lot more confident. And also a thread repair kit. So there's these things that are basically like bolts, but much stronger and sharper. And if you've had a bolt that's, like I said, rusted and didn't come out easy and just a lot of gunk in there, you can put the thread repair kit through and it will clean out the way because it's got slots in the side. It's not solid spiral all the way around. It's a spiral with slots cut in. So the gunk and the corrosion and the nastiness that's keeping things from going in cleanly, you're going to put that in and pull it out and get all that out. So this is my foray into mechanics. That's my latest hobby. But the 4-wheeler will ride again. I believe it, even though I hooked up the battery backwards, blew a fuse, and the only computer on the thing, and now I need to get a replacement for that. Because there was dirt on the battery, and I thought that I hooked the plus, but I turned it around because, but it will ride again. I'm certain of it.
I have screwed up cars, working on cars. I've never put the battery in backward. I will just...
Well, because normally one terminal is much larger and the other one is smaller, but these are very small.
And they're usually clearly marked.
This one, it just has a raised indentation of a circle and a plus and a raised indentation of a circle with a minus. And with the right dirt in the right places, the plus can look like a minus and the minus can look like a plus. Maybe I should clean that off. But yeah, I got turned around and I forgot that moved it in that way. And so no spark.
So I'm going to throw out some picks. The first one is I always pick a game. And the game I'm going to pick, this is a relatively simple game. It's called Antidote, and it's a card game. And what you do is you pass out a certain number of cards, and everybody gets 2 cards that are either the a poison card or a syringe card. And sometimes you get 2 of the poisons. And what you're trying to do is you've pulled one of the poisons out. You're trying to identify the right one so that you can have the antidote because everybody's been poisoned. And so then you have basically antidotes, and there are 5 antidote cards of each kind, and you pass all those out too. And then you go around, and every time somebody takes a turn, they can either trade a card with somebody else, or they can pass a card to the right or the left, right? And everybody passes a card, or you can make everybody discard a card. And you're trying to figure out which antidote you need and get the highest number of that antidote that you can, right? And so whoever gets the highest number out there. So if somebody discards the 5 of that number, then whoever holds on to the 4 at the end of the game, that's their last card, they win. And that's how you play it. It took us about 20, 25 minutes, but it's a lot of fun. You wind up looking at what people are discarding. You wind up trading a bunch of those cards. They have X's on them, so we call them X cards, but they're the poisons. And it was a lot of fun. It was really fun. And yeah, I forgot to look it up on Board Game Geek, so I'll do that real quick. But anyway, it was a lot of fun just to kind of play. And we played it a couple of times. Played it with the teenagers. It has a weight of 1.62. So fairly easy to pick up. It says on here 20 to 30 minutes. So, we were right on par with that. We played it with about 5 people. I think that's probably a good number. You can play up to 7 people. I'm imagining with 2 people, it's a little less interesting. But yeah, so Antidote is my game pick. And then I've been mentioning the JavaScript conference I mentioned at the top of the show. You can go to topenddevs.com/conferences. You can click it. I'll also get jsremoteconf.com pointed over there. And that way you can go and you can check it out. The CFP is open. It'll be open through the end of September. And then, I'm going to start reaching out to people and see if we can get speakers. I've already had a few people say they're interested, but I haven't finalized. And so I don't want to announce, we have so-and-so coming if that's the week they're on vacation with their family or something. So we'll work that out. I'm really, really looking forward to that. If you're into Rails, we're doing a Rails one in September, and then we're going to do some for some of the other frameworks and technologies that we cover on our shows heading into November, December, January. So keep an eye out for that. If your company wants to sponsor, that would be awesome. You can just DM me on Twitter, email me, chuck@topenddevs.com. But yeah, that's kind of what I've been working on lately. And then I finished 1883, so I'm going to pick that as well. So good. So good. I think I liked it better than Yellowstone. So, which is saying something because I really enjoyed Yellowstone. So I'm going to pick that too. 1883 was awesome. I think that's pretty much it. So thanks everyone for listening. Until next time, Max out.
Bye.
Adios.
Bandwidth for this segment is provided by CacheFly, the world's fastest CDN. Deliver your content fast with CacheFly. Visit CacheFly.com to learn more.